There's a couple of things to keep in mind here. The one thing is that these are real people. And so throughout the early church, there are all sorts of traditions and records and oral tradition about what happens to these characters in these stories. So oftentimes I'll hear folks say things like, well, I wonder what happened to the woman at the well. And anybody who's familiar with Christian tradition would, say, oh, you mean Photini? Like, we actually know her name. We know what actually happened to her after that encounter with Jesus. I wonder what happened to Zacchaeus, right? The short guy who climbs up the tree and tries to see Jesus. Well, he became a bishop, right? Like, we actually do know things about Zacchaeus. I wonder what happened to Lazarus. Lazarus became a bishop off in Cyprus. And I actually went and I visited the church in Cyprus where he presided as bishop, and I saw and venerated his bones, right? We actually do throughout Christian tradition. One of the things that I think folks who are only familiar with the Bible tend to forget is that these are real people. These are real people that lived real lives and met other people within the early Christian church. And that's why we have oral traditions about what transpired. That's why we have records and other traditions about what they did with their lives. That's why we have certain relics related to them, where they were, where they lived, where they died, the things that transpired around them. And so even though the Gospels certainly do give us truths, right? Reliable records of these individuals in this, sliver of a person's story, there is more to that story. And Christian tradition is not typically left wondering in many of these cases about the characters that show up in the gospel accounts. We do have clear traditions of what transpired with these characters after that little snapshot that the gospel offers to us. And that includes these different glimpses that we get of the nativity story. There's more within Christian tradition about what transpired than just what is recorded in the gospel accounts. And this does go to a second point, which has to do with the Christian tradition, disposition toward tradition generally. Again, this is not going to be an episode about sola scriptura, right? Whether or not theology should be based on the Bible alone or whatnot. Obviously, those who know me and know my work, they know I am an Eastern Orthodox Christian, so I'm not an advocate of sola scriptura. But what I will say is that, St. Paul, when writing to the Thessalonians, tells people to abide by whatever he tells them, whether by word of mouth or by epistle. And the church fathers took this quite seriously. In fact, Basil of Caesarea, for example, actually talks about at one point where he says, well, obviously we wouldn't reduce Christian practice to just what the apostles wrote down, because if we did that, there's a bunch of stuff that they told us to do that we wouldn't do anymore. And then he goes on and he names stuff, that that Protestants don't do anymore, like praying facing east and other things. And so the fact of the matter is that the church fathers insisted they held in hand both oral tradition and biblical records. So it had always been part of the early Christian tradition that part of what they held, what they believed, right, what they affirmed, wasn't just the things that had been recorded by the apostles because there was some conflict or something that occasioned the writing of it within a letter, but rather that there was a broader understanding of the things that had been written down, handed down by epistle, but also things that had been handed down by word of mouth, things like tradition. And I know that tradition is oftentimes a dirty word sometimes because, this is actually in partly due to translators. So a lot of Bible translators are, for obvious reasons, Protestants, right? Because Protestantism had always elevated the importance of Scripture, given its doctrine of sola scriptura. So Bible translation had always been an important feature of the Protestant world. And so for that reason, a lot of Bible translators are Protestants. And one of the things that happens as a result is that sometimes the translations are reflective of either theological ignorance of certain, Christian traditions or theology that is foreign to Protestantism, or reflective of certain Protestant biases. And one of those is how the word parodosis, which is tradition, is sometimes handled. So what you'll see in a lot of Bible translations is that there is a reference to tradition within the Bible that appears in English, in the English translations, whenever Christ is talking about the traditions of the Pharisees. But when Paul uses the word tradition in a positive way, that ends up being translated something else, and the word is obscured. And so as a result, what ends up happening is people are left with the impression that the Bible only speaks about tradition in a negative way. Tradition is something that is negative because this is the sort of thing that that gives rise to pharisaical, extra-biblical practices that are repugnant to God. And that's what comes through as a result of those translations. But the fact of the matter is, when Paul talks about people, following what has been handed down, St. Paul is using the word protasis. So he's actually advocating. Paul does advocate protasis. There's good traditions, and then there's bad traditions, right? And so Christianity has always advocated, had a concern for what was handed down, because that's literally what the word protasis, that is translated tradition, means, right? To hand down. And so Paul is advocating to the Thessalonians, for example, that they're to abide by whatever has been handed down to them, whether by word of mouth or by epistle. And so you see this reflected in the disposition of the church fathers. The church fathers are deeply concerned with what has been handed down. In many ways, one of the ways I like to put it is they saw themselves less as theologians or as philosophers and more as curators, right? They are people who are protectors or keepers of something that has been handed down to them, something that's been entrusted to them. And you see this, for example, in a lot of the ecumenical disputes. So for folks who are unfamiliar, within the early Christian church, every now and then there were always controversies emerging. There were always heresies emerging. That's been emerging since the time of the New Testament. But every now and then a heresy would get to, a flashpoint within the Roman Empire where it would become a big enough deal. It's threatening to rip apart the church, and you would end up having what's called an ecumenical council, right? The whole of the church gathers together, the representatives of the church, the bishops, gather together and hold a council, right? Which is an ecumenical council, a council of, the representative of the whole. And this first happens with the Council of Nicea, which is called by Constantine because of the Arian dispute, right? So the dispute between Athanasius of Alexandria and Arius of Alexandria over the question of whether or not the Son of God, right, whether Christ is fully God, right? Is he truly God, or is he just like a really godlike creature? Is he just sort of God in a laudatory title, or is he really of the same nature as God the Father? And out of the first ecumenical council, the Council of Nicea, and then the second ecumenical council, the Council of Constantinople, we get the Nicene Creed. So that's actually the only creed that is ecumenically binding. Like every Christian tradition holds the Nicene Creed. All the other creeds tend to be Latin Western creeds like the Apostles' Creed or the Athanasian Creed. The Nicene Creed is only is the only real authoritative ecumenical creed. And that comes out of those ecumenical councils, the Council of Nicea and Constantinople. It's referred to the Nicene Creed because of the Council of Nicea, even though what was written at Nicea ended up being expanded at Constantinople. So it's really the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, but that's a mouthful. And nobody wants to say that, which is why we call it the Nicene Creed. Anyway, I bring that up because there's only ever been 7 ecumenical councils, which took place throughout the first 1,000 years of the church. And I know that there's going to be asterisks here where people are like, what about this and what about that? I'm aware, but we're doing, bird's eye view sort of stuff here. So let's just sort of acknowledge that the sort of standard talking point about this is that there are 7 ecumenical councils throughout the first 1,000 years of the church. And my point is not about the ecumenical councils, but about the disposition that you see throughout the ecumenical councils. So one of the things that emerges out of those councils is that throughout the council, the question that's always being asked is, what did we receive? And so you see them asking, these church fathers asking all the time, well, we received something. The apostles gave us something. There was a faith that was handed down. And that's what we're supposed to protect. That's what we're supposed to practice. That's what we're supposed to live. That's what we're supposed to believe. That's what we're supposed to profess. And so what is it? right? Arius is telling us it's one thing, and Athanasius is telling us it's another thing. Arius is telling us that, to be true to the faith is to say that the Son of God is a creature. And Athanasius is telling us that, to be true to the faith, you have to affirm that the Son of God is eternally begotten of the Father, and he's of the same nature as the Father. So which one is it, right? Which one is what we receive? And so at the end of the day, the ecumenical councils, what you see as a consistent thread running throughout those councils, you see this disposition, where the concern is not, well, that's an interesting conundrum you've raised there, Arius. I wonder how we might solve that. And let's get out our Bibles and let's get out our philosophical whiteboard and let's crack this nut, right? Let's figure out this problem and solve it. They're not doing that, right? They're not innovators. Actually, innovation was always seen as a very dangerous word amongst the church fathers because we received something. We are protectors and curators of a faith that was handed down. That's our job, to protect it and to preserve it, not to innovate. And so that disposition that says we are called by the apostles themselves to abide by what has been handed down by tradition is central to their disposition. And you see this emerge over and over and over again. John of Damascus, a church father who I dearly love, brilliant philosopher, 8th century. He's central to the entire icon controversy, which is the focus of the 7th Ecumenical Council. John of Damascus writes a treatise called An Exact Exposition of the Orthodox Faith, or On the Orthodox Faith for short. And one of the things that you see whenever you open that up and you look at it, John of Damascus is concerned with identifying what is the consensus of the church fathers before him and adding nothing to it. Right. So this is a disposition that comes up again and again within these controversies. Part of the question that you see emerge over and over with the church fathers is, what did we receive? And that's indicative of this concern for good tradition. Yes, the Pharisees embodied a corrupt tradition, something that, as Christ calls them out on, sometimes traditions that got them off the hook for keeping the law or something like that. But with the church fathers, they recognize that we've been called to abide by good tradition, right? St. Paul tells us that there are things that have been handed down, and we're supposed to protect that and abide by that and stick with the faith that's once been given over to the saints, as St. Jude puts it. And so that was the concern, right? Good tradition. And so I bring that up, this rather long prelude about tradition, in order to say that amongst the traditions of the early Christians were the traditions about saints, were the traditions about people like Zacchaeus, like Photini, and including with the Nativity, things like the life and the story of the Virgin Mary, and specifically the Nativity story. Many of the traditions, as I said, many of the traditions concerning the Nativity that I'm about to relay, some of these are commemorated on the liturgical calendar, Catholic or Orthodox. Some of these appear in the Church Fathers, and then some appear in the Gospel of James. Now, if you've never heard of the Gospel of James, let me just say a little bit about what it is. There are all sorts of Gnostic Gospels in the early church, right? So these are sort of texts that are written by heretical groups, the Gnostics, and contain heretical doctrines. This is where you get, like, if you've ever heard of the Gospel of Judas, which was discovered, a couple of decades back, and people were, shocked. What is this? And a lot of people are thrown by this because they've never heard of this sort of thing. Candidly, anybody who had read Irenaeus before they ever discovered the Gospel of Judas already knew about the Gospel of Judas, because Irenaeus catalogs, all sorts of things about the Gnostics that's pervasive in his on heresies text. And so he had already mentioned that sort of thing. So we know about those texts. And those are obviously just overtly and rejected by the Christians because they're recognized to contain heretical teachings. However, there were other texts within the early church that were not considered to be biblical. They were not considered to be authentically, written by whoever had suggested, they were written by, such as, the Gospel of James or the Gospel of Nicodemus is another one. But they were not deemed heretical. They were deemed to be a reflection of early Christian traditions. And so in this sense, they're not, sort of an infallible, God-inspired, source of scripture or something like that, but they nonetheless do represent basically literature of a certain kind, which is early Christian literature that was treated with, some amount of reliability in the sense that it records early Christian traditions. And so the Gospel of Nicodemus is one of these. The Gospel of James is one of these. And obviously these are named for, we know who Nicodemus is from the Gospels. We know from who, James is from the Gospels. And it was rather common in the ancient world that you would end up sort of writing something in the spirit of somebody else, right? The Book of Enoch, it's not written by Enoch, right? But, but this was a common thing that you would see in ancient literature, where somebody sort of appropriates a certain figure's name and writes in the spirit of that figure. And so we had these sort of these gospels of a certain kind within the early church that were not deemed to be scripture, but nonetheless were also not rejected as heretical. They sort of occupy this middle space of just early Christian literature. And for that reason, it offers some insights into the traditions that floated around in the Christian mind. And so I bring this up because actually both the Gospel of James and the Gospel of Nicodemus is relevant to the sorts of things that we're going to be talking about here. So the Gospel of James, second century text, many of the things that it references also echo in certain early Christian writers, like Origen and lots of others, Ignatius. And the reason I bring that up is because in that letter, in that Substack post, I actually can include all of these different citations for where you can find the references to all these different things within the church fathers. And these traditions are very old. This is not sort of later innovation type stuff. This is definitely the sorts of traditions that you start to find in people like Ignatius of Antioch, right? Who is an apostolic father. Apostolic fathers, if you've never heard that term, are church fathers who knew the apostles, right? So they were, direct line to the apostles. So if you're interested in citations and going like, well, where is this? Which church fathers? Where? What texts? You could go to that post and you could find the various citations that point you in the right direction regarding, all the different things that I'm going to talk about here. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.